back to Study Hole's Philosophy Friday. Today we're going to be diving into some seriously thought-provoking stuff, and I am really excited to talk about this with you. Michel Foucault.
Michel Foucault.
And his ideas about the repressive hypothesis. Have you heard of this before?
Oh, yeah, certainly.
The idea that, Western society has been, pushing sexuality under the rug since, the 17th century.
Yeah.
All, hush-hush and, Victorian fainting couches.
Right.
Well, Foucault, in his book, The History of Sexuality, kind of wants to, challenge that whole narrative.
Well, and what's really fascinating about Foucault's approach is that he doesn't simply say, nope, repression is a myth.
Right.
Instead, he kind of digs into how the very act of, saying that sex is repressed actually kind of keeps it front and center.
So explain that a little bit.
Right.
By saying we shouldn't talk about something,
right,
we end up actually talking about it more.
Exactly. It's a kind of a sneaky paradox. You
right.
know? So Foucault is arguing that instead of silencing sexuality, Western society actually became kind of obsessed with talking about it, with analyzing it, with categorizing it. He calls this incitement to discourse.
Okay.
And it's way more complex than just, plain old repression.
So let's think about that classic example of so-called sexual repression.
Okay. The Victorian era.
All buttoned up and proper. Right. But Foucault points out that's when we actually see this explosion of discourse on sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah. It is counterintuitive, right? You'd expect silence.
Yeah.
But instead you get this outpouring of rules, regulations, medical texts, all focused on sex.
Right.
Think about it. The expansion of confessional practices within the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Suddenly it's not enough to just confess, that you stole an apple.
Right.
Now you've got to spill all the beans on your sexual thoughts and acts. Stuff that might have just flown under the radar before.
And that's where Foucault's concept of power really comes in. He says, power isn't just about saying no. It's about generating knowledge, shaping how we think and talk about things. In this case, sex. And that knowledge then becomes a way to control behavior.
So it's not about suppressing sex altogether.
Right.
It's more about directing it, squeezing it into these certain acceptable boxes.
Precisely. Power, for Foucault, is productive.
Okay.
It doesn't just shut things down. It creates categories, definitions, norms, and, these in turn influence how we experience and understand sexuality.
And Foucault sees this incitement to discourse happening everywhere, not just in the church.
Absolutely.
He points to, the rise of psychiatry and its fascination with classifying all sorts of perversions.
Right. Now you've got doctors kind of dissecting every sexual act, labeling it, deciding what's normal and what's pathological. It's like they're building this whole taxonomy of desire.
Right.
And anything that falls outside those carefully drawn lines is deemed, deviant.
He even uses this wild example from a book called My Secret Life.
Oh, yeah.
Which is an anonymous autobiography by this wealthy Victorian dude who meticulously documents, meticulously all of his sexual escapades.
Talk about oversharing, right?
Right.
But Foucault sees this as significant because it shows how this urge to reveal, to confess, wasn't just confined to the church.
Right.
It seeped into society, showing up in scientific, medical, even personal spaces.
So if we're swimming in all this talk about sex,
right,
all these classifications and confessions,
how
does that actually square with the idea of repression?
Yeah, that's the point, right.
Foucault's saying it's not so simple.
Exactly. He argues that the repressive hypothesis is a bit of a smokescreen, It makes us think that power is just saying no to sex when it's actually way more subtle and pervasive.
So instead of repression, we get this whole system that is simultaneously obsessed with sex and intent on policing it through language, categories, and all these expert opinions.
Yes, and the repressive hypothesis itself actually becomes a tool of that system.
Whoa.
It pushes us to define ourselves in relation to what's considered normal or deviant.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
How often do we talk about sex in terms of what's forbidden or taboo?
Right.
Could it be that those very conversations are keeping us trapped in this system Foucault describes?
Now that's a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if the pursuit of sexual liberation fighting against so-called repression is really about freedom, or if it's just a different form of control.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That is mind-bending.
It is.
So if Foucault is right, what does that mean for how we understand power, sexuality, ourselves all these big
Huge questions.
We will dig into all of those after a quick break.
Sounds good. Yeah, it really makes you question all those assumptions we have about like freedom and liberation, right? Especially when it comes to sexuality.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, you know, Foucault doesn't stop with just the church and psychiatry. He sees this incitement to discourse kind of popping up in like other areas of society too, like education.
Absolutely, yeah. He points to all those school regulations that seem so obsessive, like rules about how close students can stand to each other,
Right.
what they can wear, even what they can talk about when it comes to sex.
Well, it's like they're trying to control every little detail, every thought, like every potential impulse.
Exactly. And Foucault's arguing that, those rules weren't just about like maintaining order in the classroom. They were about like shaping young minds, instilling these very specific ideas about what's appropriate, what's acceptable when it comes to sex.
Almost like society was becoming this giant microscope, zooming in on sexuality from all these different angles, categorizing, labeling, and ultimately like controlling it.
And this is where, the concept of perversion becomes really central to Foucault's analysis. Because he's not saying that, society was trying to repress all sexuality. Okay. It's more about like identifying and controlling those specific behaviors that deviate from the norm.
Right. So it's not about suppressing sex like in general.
Right.
It's about saying, okay, these particular acts, these desires, those are the problem.
Precisely. And the 19th century saw this explosion of interest in classifying all these different perversions, especially within psychiatry. Suddenly you have homosexuality, fetishism, sadism, masochism, this whole taxonomy of sexual deviance.
Like they're creating a hierarchy of desire, right?
Yes.
With like certain acts at the top deemed healthy and normal,
right,
and others relegated to the bottom, like the sick, the twisted, the, perverse.
And by labeling these perversions as like medical or psychological disorders, society was able to kind of pathologize certain behaviors, treat them as illnesses needing intervention and correction.
So it's not just about moral condemnation anymore.
Right.
It becomes a matter of like scientific authority.
Yeah.
Doctors and psychiatrists become these new arbiters of what's sexually acceptable.
And that's where Foucault sees a real shift in how power operates.
Okay.
It's less about like punishing transgressions outright and more about normalizing behavior, nudging individuals to conform to these new standards of sexual health.
So even as society seems to be like opening up, talking more about sex, it's also finding more subtle and insidious ways to control it.
Yes, and that's one of the most unsettling aspects of Foucault's work, I think. He's suggesting that even the pursuit of knowledge about sexuality, even when it's in the name of science or medicine, can be intertwined with the exercise of power.
It's like you think you're gaining knowledge, you think you're liberating yourself,
right,
but maybe you're just playing into this larger system of control.
And Foucault doesn't just focus on like the individual level. He also talks about how, this obsession with sexuality becomes a way for the state to manage entire populations.
Okay.
He calls this biopower.
Ah, biopower.
Right.
So we're not just talking about like individual desires anymore.
Right.
But about like controlling the sexual behavior of entire groups of people.
Exactly. Modern states, Foucault argues, become increasingly interested in regulating sex to manage things like, birth rates, public health, even the overall like fitness of the population. Think about like those anxieties around degenerate populations we discussed earlier.
So suddenly sex isn't just a personal matter.
Right.
It becomes a political issue, intertwined with all sorts of agendas about like social engineering and national strength.
Precisely. And this drive to regulate sex, this biopolitical imperative, often hides behind this mask of liberation and freedom.
It's like we need to understand and categorize all these sexual behaviors.
Right.
So we can free ourselves from the shackles of repression.
Yeah, but Foucault argues that this is just another way that power operates.
Okay.
It disguises itself as a force for good, even as it exerts control over our bodies, our desires, our very identities.
This is all pretty heavy stuff.
It is.
It makes you wonder.
Right.
If we're constantly being told to like express ourselves sexually, to embrace our desires, are we really free? Or are we just caught in this subtle web of power relations?
That's the question Foucault leaves us with, and it's a question that's even more relevant today,
Yeah.
In a world that's saturated with, like, sexual imagery and discourse,
Yeah.
where we're constantly bombarded with these messages about who we should be, how we should desire.
It's like we're given this illusion of choice,
Yeah.
this sense that we're in control of our sexuality.
Yeah.
But maybe those choices are being, like, shaped, influenced, even manufactured in ways we don't fully realize.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's what makes Foucault so challenging and so important.
Uh-huh.
He forces us to look beyond the surface, to question these narratives we've been given about sexuality,
Yeah.
power, and even freedom itself.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly being nudged to express ourselves sexually, to embrace our desires, but within a very specific framework, defined by all these forces that Foucault's talking about.
Right. Yeah, and that's really the genius of Foucault's analysis, right? He's showing us how even the language of liberation and freedom can be kind of co-opted, and used to serve the interests of power.
So are we ever really in control of our own sexuality? Or are we all just kind of like puppets dancing to the tune of societal expectations?
I mean, that's like the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, I think it's one that, like, each individual listener really needs to kind of grapple with on their own.
Yeah, Foucault doesn't give us a lot of easy answers, does he?
Not really.
But he gives us the tools to start asking, like, the right questions.
Yeah, he does. I mean, his work encourages us to be, like, critical of the messages that we're bombarded with every day,
Right.
to question the assumptions that shape our understanding of sex, and to be wary of anyone who claims to hold the key to, sexual liberation.
Yeah, because maybe true freedom lies in, like, recognizing and resisting those subtle ways that power operates, even in those most intimate areas of our lives.
Exactly. And that's perhaps, the most enduring legacy of Foucault's work, right? He empowers us to become more aware of the forces that shape our desires, our identities, our very understanding of what it means to be human.
So as we're kind of wrapping up our deep dive into Foucault's ideas, I want to leave you with this thought.
All right.
What if instead of searching for, like, some ultimate truth about sexuality, we focused on understanding the power dynamics that are at play? How might that change the way we talk about sex, desire, and even relationships?
Yeah. It's a really powerful shift in perspective, right? Instead of seeking answers, we start asking, like, more critical questions.
Right.
Become more aware of the forces that are shaping our experiences. And that awareness in itself can be incredibly liberating.
It is. It's a lot of food for thought.
It is.
So thank you for joining us for another Philosophy Friday here at Study Hall. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you next time.